Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. I never thought I'd have to fight for something that was rightfully mine, but when I arrived at the land my uncle left me, I found construction crews hard at work on my property. And when I demanded answers, they told me the impossible. My land had already been sold by the HOA. It all started with a phone call from my lawyer informing me that my late Uncle George had left me a vacant plot of land in Fairview, a quiet, upscale suburban neighborhood known for its pristine lawns, cookie-cutter houses, and, most importantly, an aggressive homeowners association. Uncle George had always been a bit of a rebel, the kind of man who despised rules and refused to let anyone tell him how to live his life. It didn't surprise me that he had never joined the HOA. He always told me that property rights were sacred and that no one, not even an overzealous community board, should have the power to dictate what a person could do with their own land. At the time, I didn't give much thought to the inheritance. The plot was just sitting there, untouched, with no immediate need for me to do anything about it. I had my own life, work deadlines, bills, and the general chaos of adulthood. The land was mine legally, but in my mind, it was just a technicality, something I'd deal with when I had time. That was my first mistake. About 6 months later, I finally carved out a weekend to drive up to Fairview and check on the property. I wasn't expecting much, maybe some overgrown grass, a few weeds, and the kind of silence that accompanies an abandoned lot. But the moment I turned onto the street, my stomach twisted into a knot. Something was wrong. A massive construction sign stood at the front of what should have been my vacant land. Workers in hard hats moved with purpose, operating heavy machinery and laying the foundation for what appeared to be a new residential development on my property. I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of my car, my pulse hammering in my ears. A large banner flapped in the wind displaying the words, "Willow Creek, Luxury Townhomes by Brixton Development." My land, my inheritance, was no longer a quiet, untouched lot. It was now an active construction site. I stormed up to the nearest worker, a guy in an orange vest with a clipboard in hand. "Hey, what the hell is going on here?" I demanded, barely able to keep my voice steady. The man glanced up, barely sparing me a look before returning to his clipboard. "Sorry, sir, this is an active construction zone. You'll need to stay back for safety reasons." "Active construction zone," I scoffed. "This is my land. What are you building here?" The worker frowned, finally looking up. I think you're mistaken. This lot was sold to Brixton Development by the Fairview Homeowners Association. They've owned it for months now." My heart stopped. My skin went ice cold. "Sold?" My voice barely came out. The worker gave me a look that suggested he had better things to do than entertain some confused guy questioning reality. "Yeah. Brixton Development purchased this land from the HOA and got all the permits approved. Now, if you don't mind, I have work to do." I didn't move. I couldn't. My brain was struggling to process the insanity of what I had just heard. The HOA sold my land. It didn't make any sense. My uncle had never signed the property over to them. He hated HOAs. There was no way in hell he had willingly handed it over, and yet here I was, staring at construction equipment tearing up the ground that belonged to me. There had to be a mistake. Clenching my fists, I turned away from the site and marched straight back to my car. There was only one place to get answers. I was going to the HOA office, and someone was going to explain to me exactly what the hell was going on. I drove straight to the Fairview HOA office, barely able to contain my anger. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, my mind racing with 100 different scenarios. There had to be some kind of mistake, maybe a clerical error, some mix-up in paperwork. Surely no one had the legal authority to sell my land without my knowledge or consent. The HOA office was nestled in the middle of the pristine neighborhood, a small but elegant brick building with a well-manicured lawn and a sign that read, "Fairview Homeowners Association, preserving the community since 1998. I clenched my jaw at the irony. Preserving, more like stealing. As soon as I stepped inside, the cool air conditioning did nothing to chill my boiling frustration. The place was eerily quiet, the type of silence that only exists in offices where self-important people thrive on making others miserable. Behind the main desk sat a woman in her late 40s, with a tight blonde bob and a smug expression that screamed power trip. A gold-plated nameplate on her desk read, "Karen Wells, HOA President." Of course, Karen looked up from her computer, offering me a plastic smile, the kind that barely concealed the underlying condescension. "Good afternoon," she said smoothly. "How can I help you?" I stepped up to the desk, barely able to contain the storm brewing inside me. "You can start by explaining why there's a construction crew on my land." Her expression didn't change, but I caught the subtle flicker of amusement in her eyes. She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "Oh, you must be Mr. Collins." The fact that she already knew who I was made my stomach churn. "Yes," I snapped. "And I'd like to know why the HOA thinks it has the right to sell property that doesn't belong to them." Karen sighed, tilting her head like she was about to explain something to a particularly slow child. "Mr. Collins, I understand that this might be a surprise to you, but the Fairview HOA operates under very specific guidelines when it comes to abandoned and neglected properties. Your uncle's land had been sitting vacant for years with no active development or maintenance. According to our bylaws, the association has the authority to reclaim such lots for the betterment of the community." I felt my blood pressure spike. "Reclaim?" I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. "You make it sound like my uncle abandoned it. He owned that land outright. He refused to be part of the HOA. That land was never under your jurisdiction." Karen gave me a sympathetic yet smug smile. "Oh, but it was, Mr. Collins. You see, while your uncle may have thought he was exempt from the HOA, there were old zoning records that, shall we say, disputed that assumption. Once the property was deemed inactive and unmaintained, it fell under the HOA's domain, per our charter." My hands clenched into fists. "That's bullshit. My uncle never signed anything over to you." Karen's smile did not waver. Perhaps not directly, but when ownership transferred upon his passing, the HOA was within its rights to take necessary action. The property has already been legally transferred to Brixton Development, and their project has been approved by the city. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. "You're telling me you stole my inheritance and sold it?" My voice was barely controlled rage. Karen's expression finally hardened. "We acted in the best interest of the community, Mr. Collins. Your land was sitting there, useless. Now it's going to bring in valuable new housing and increase property values for all of Fairview. That's what we do here. We ensure progress." I let out a bitter laugh. "This isn't progress. It's theft." Karen sighed dramatically and reached for a folder on her desk. "Mr. Collins, I don't know what you're hoping to accomplish here, but I can assure you that this matter is settled. You can take it to the courts if you like, but I'd advise you not to waste your time." She slid the folder across the desk toward me. "This is a copy of the sale documentation. You'll find that everything was handled according to protocol." I picked up the folder and flipped it open. The paperwork was thorough, and to my horror, it even included a falsified signature. Mine. My breath caught in my throat. "This is a forgery." Karen shrugged, completely unfazed. "Then prove it." That was it. That was the moment I knew. I wasn't just dealing with overreach or a bureaucratic nightmare. This was deliberate, calculated fraud. I slammed the folder shut. "You haven't heard the last of this." Karen simply smiled, leaning back in her chair with disgusting confidence. "I'll be looking forward to it." I stormed out of the HOA office, the folder clutched so tightly in my hand that the edges crumpled. My heart pounded with a mixture of rage and disbelief. They forged my signature. They had taken my uncle's land and sold it right out from under me. And Karen had the audacity to smirk like she had just conducted a perfectly legal business transaction instead of outright theft. I needed a lawyer immediately. Driving back toward the city, I called up Sarah Green, a real estate attorney I had worked with before on a minor zoning dispute. She picked up on the second ring. "Sarah, it's Andrew Collins," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "I need legal help. Fast." "Andrew? What's going on?" she asked, sounding instantly alert. "The Fairview HOA stole my land and sold it, with a forged signature." There was a pause. Then, "Come to my office." Now. An hour later, I sat across from Sarah in her downtown office, the folder of fraudulent documents spread out across her desk. She skimmed through them, her eyes narrowing as she flipped through each page. "This is bad," she muttered. "They didn't just pull a fast one on you, Andrew. They fabricated an entire legal transfer." "No kidding," I gritted out. "Can we take this to court? File a lawsuit?" Sarah exhaled sharply, tapping her nails against the desk. "Yes, but it's not going to be easy. HOAs are notoriously difficult to fight, and Fairview is one of the more aggressive ones. The fact that they got this deal pushed through means they likely have connections inside the zoning office, maybe even the county records department. We need proof, concrete proof, that they forged these documents. I leaned forward. What do we need? For starters, an independent handwriting analysis of your supposed signature. Then, we need to cross-check public records to see how they justified transferring the deed. If we can find even one instance of procedural misconduct, we can unravel the entire sale. I nodded, determination hardening inside me. Let's do it. Over the next 3 days, Sarah and I worked nonstop. We got a handwriting expert to confirm that the signature on the sale documents was not mine. We dug through public records and discovered that the HOA had used an obscure zoning loophole to classify my land as abandoned. We found emails leaked anonymously showing Karen communicating directly with Brixton Development months before the sale was even finalized. It was a blatant conspiracy. Then the threat started. The first was subtle, a formal letter from the HOA's legal team, warning me that if I continued harassing their office, they would pursue legal action against me for defamation. The second was less subtle. Late one evening, as I was leaving Sarah's office, I noticed a black SUV idling near my car. When I approached, the window rolled down just enough for me to hear a deep, calm voice. "Drop it, Collins," the man said. I couldn't see his face, just the faint glow of a cigarette. "It's done. Walk away while you still can." The window rolled up, and the SUV sped off into the night. I stood frozen for a second, my pulse pounding in my ears. This wasn't just about stealing land anymore. They were willing to silence me to keep it. I wasn't the type to scare easily, but that night, as I replayed the SUV encounter in my head, I realized just how deep this went. This wasn't just some clerical error or an HOA overstepping their boundaries. This was organized corruption, and if they were bold enough to send a veiled threat like that, I had no doubt they would go further. The next morning, I woke up to find a bright red violation notice taped to my apartment door. "Mr. Collins, your vehicle has been observed in unauthorized areas within Fairview Estates. Per HOA bylaws, repeat infractions will result in fines and legal action." I nearly laughed at the absurdity. I didn't even live in Fairview. But the message was clear. They were watching me. Then the phone calls started. At first, it was from anonymous numbers, silence on the other end, the kind of thing meant to make me uneasy. Then came the more direct approach. My employer received an email from someone claiming I was under investigation for fraud. The wording was just vague enough to sound official, but my boss saw right through it. "Who the hell did you piss off, Andrew?" he asked, shoving his phone in my face. "The worst kind of people," I muttered, already forwarding the email to Sarah. By the third day, I noticed the same black SUV circling my apartment complex. It would park across the street for hours at a time, engine running. When I walked outside, the driver would tilt his phone slightly as if taking pictures. That night, I installed security cameras around my apartment. I wasn't going to be caught off guard. Then, my bank account froze. When I checked online, my card was declined due to suspicious activity. A quick call to my bank revealed that multiple fraudulent transactions had been attempted using my information. Someone had filed a false fraud claim against me, trying to lock me out of my own finances. That was it. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking with anger, and called Sarah. "We're going all in," I said. She didn't hesitate. "Then let's tear them apart." I had given the HOA every chance to back down, to correct their mistake, but they had made their stance clear. They weren't just trying to keep the land, they were trying to ruin me. They thought intimidation would make me walk away. They were wrong. Sarah and I spent the next 48 hours gathering every shred of evidence we had. We weren't just going to fight this in court. We were going to drag it into the light. First, Sarah filed an injunction to immediately halt all construction on my property. If we could prove fraud, we could legally freeze the development. The request went straight to a judge, and within a day, a temporary cease and desist order was issued to Brixton Development. But I wasn't stopping there. I reached out to every investigative journalist I could find. HOA corruption wasn't new, but a case like this, where they had outright stolen and sold private property, that was a scandal. And the media ate it up. By the next morning, a headline was splashed across local news sites. Homeowners Association caught in property theft scheme, victim fights back. It wasn't just local journalists who took interest. A major real estate blog picked it up, and within hours, HOA watchdog groups started digging into Fairview's past. And what they found was even worse than I expected. Fairview HOA had a history of shady dealings. They had fined homeowners into foreclosure, seized properties under the guise of unpaid dues, and resold them to investors. My case was just the latest in a long line of abuses, and now the world was watching. Karen's response was immediate. I got a cease and desist letter that afternoon warning me of defamation and threatening a lawsuit if I didn't stop speaking to the press. I laughed and sent it straight to my lawyer. If they wanted a war, they had one. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread quickly, and now everyone wanted to see Fairview HOA face the consequences of their corruption. Journalists lined the back rows, their cameras poised. Residents of Fairview, many of whom had probably feared the HOA for years, watched with cautious curiosity. Even members of the city zoning board had shown up, likely wondering how deep this scandal was about to go. I sat next to Sarah, my hands clenched under the table. Across from us, Karen Wells sat with her expensive legal team, her expression carefully neutral. But I could see it in her eyes, the flicker of nervousness. She wasn't in control anymore. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with decades of experience, called the session to order. "Mr. Collins, your counsel may proceed." Sarah stood, smoothing her blazer. "Your Honor, the evidence in this case is overwhelming. The Fairview HOA illegally seized my client's property, forged documents to authorize its sale, and profited from this fraud. Today, we will prove beyond a doubt that this was not a mistake, but a deliberate, calculated scheme." She walked toward the judge's bench and handed over the first batch of exhibits. A certified forensic report proving that the signature on the deed transfer was forged. City zoning emails exposing how Karen had pushed through approval for the development months before the sale was even finalized. Bank statements revealing suspicious payments between Fairview HOA and Brixton Development. "Let's talk about that last point," Sarah continued, her voice steady. "A financial audit uncovered a $50,000 payment from Brixton Development to the Fairview HOA, categorized as a Community Enhancement Fund. However, none of this money was reported in the HOA's public financial disclosures. Tell me, Ms. Wells, where did that money go?" Karen's lawyer immediately objected, but the judge overruled. Karen cleared her throat, feigning confusion. "That was a routine development fee." Sarah slammed down another document. "No, it wasn't. Because if we compare it to Fairview's previous transactions, we'll see that no other developer has ever paid a community enhancement fund. This was a bribe. Ms. Wells." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Karen shifted uncomfortably, but Sarah wasn't done. She gestured toward the door. "And to confirm that, we've subpoenaed an expert witness, a former Fairview HOA board member who resigned over these exact unethical practices." The doors swung open, and in walked Paul Matthews, a former HOA treasurer. He looked nervous but determined. The moment he sat down, Sarah wasted no time. "Mr. Matthews, can you tell the court why you resigned from the Fairview HOA?" Paul hesitated, then sighed. "Because I saw what was happening. Karen and the other board members were using loopholes to seize properties. They targeted homes with elderly or absentee owners, knowing they wouldn't fight back. They forged violations, imposed massive fines, and when owners couldn't pay, they took the land. Then they'd sell it off, often to pre-selected developers like Brixton." Gasps echoed around the room. Karen's face turned ghost white. Sarah pressed forward. "And you saw this happen firsthand?" Paul nodded. "Yes, and when I objected, I was, let's just say, encouraged to leave." The judge narrowed her eyes at Karen. "Ms. Wells, do you have anything to say?" Karen opened her mouth, but nothing came out, because in that moment she knew she was finished. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the testimony hanging thick in the air. Karen sat frozen, her carefully composed mask beginning to crack. Her lawyers whispered furiously, but she didn't seem to hear them. She knew, we all knew, that her empire was collapsing in real time. The judge exhaled sharply, tapping her gavel once. Given the gravity of these allegations and the compelling evidence presented, this court finds sufficient cause to proceed with formal fraud charges against the Fairview HOA and its leadership. That was it. The moment the words left the judge's mouth, a wave of voices broke out across the courtroom. Gasps, murmurs, hushed conversations. The reporters in the back furiously typed away, already crafting their headlines. Fairview residents exchanged looks, some shocked, some vindicated. I even caught one older man shaking his head and muttering, "About damn time." But Sarah wasn't done. She rose from her chair, her voice crisp. "Your Honor, my client also seeks immediate restitution. The fraudulent sale of his land must be nullified, and Brixton Development must halt all construction immediately." Brixton's lawyer, a man who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke up. "Your Honor, my clients acted in good faith, believing they were purchasing land legally transferred to them by the HOA. If any wrongdoing occurred, it was entirely on the part of Fairview HOA." Sarah's lips twitched into a knowing smirk. Good faith? She placed another document on the table. Then why did Brixton's CEO, Roy Davidson, exchange multiple emails with Ms. Wells 6 months before the land was ever listed as abandoned? We have the records right here. Proof that Brixton was in on this scam from the very beginning. The color drained from the lawyer's face. The judge frowned, glancing through the documents. Then she turned to Brixton's counsel. "If this is true, your clients may also be liable for damages." Roy Davidson, the CEO of Brixton Development, had been sitting smugly behind his legal team, but now he was pale as a sheet. His company had just walked into a legal disaster. He stood up suddenly. "Your Honor, Brixton Development had no knowledge of the forgery. We are willing to negotiate a settlement with Mr. Collins." I looked at Sarah, and she nodded slightly. We had them cornered. The judge considered for a moment, then slammed her gavel. "Effective immediately, the sale of the property is nullified. All construction must cease. A separate hearing will determine financial penalties and possible criminal charges against Fairview HOA and its leadership." That was it. We won. Karen sank back into her chair, her face blank with shock. I could see it in her eyes. She had spent years controlling people, wielding HOA bylaws like a weapon, and now she was powerless. As I stood to leave, Karen suddenly snapped out of her daze. She turned to me, her expression venomous. "You think this is over?" she hissed under her breath. "You have no idea who you just made an enemy of." I smiled, the first real smile I had in weeks. "Oh, I think I do," I said, my voice calm, "and I think you just lost." With that, I walked out of the courtroom, a free man, with my land back and the HOA in ruins. The victory should have felt sweeter. I had won. My land was mine again, the fraudulent sale had been overturned, and the corrupt HOA was facing criminal charges. But as I walked out of that courtroom, the weight of the past few months settled onto my shoulders like an iron cloak. This fight had cost me. It had started as a legal battle, but it had turned into a war of attrition. The sleepless nights, the threats, the paranoia of constantly looking over my shoulder, all of it had taken its toll. My name had been dragged through the mud, my finances had been frozen, and my reputation had been put through the ringer. Even though I had come out on top, I knew I had made powerful enemies. Over the next few weeks, the hammer fell hard on Fairview HOA. The entire board was dissolved under court order. Karen was formally charged with fraud, conspiracy, and falsification of documents. She was facing serious jail time. Several homeowners filed lawsuits claiming they had been illegally fined or threatened into selling their properties below market value. Karen, once untouchable, had been stripped of her power. She tried to fight back, but with all the evidence against her, even her expensive legal team abandoned her. The last I heard, she was selling her house to cover legal fees, a fitting end for a woman who had spent years dictating property values to others. As for Brixton Development, they settled quickly. They knew a prolonged fight would ruin their reputation, so they cut their losses, withdrew from the project, and paid me damages for trespassing and destruction of property. It wasn't just about the money, it was about making sure no one else tried this again. The land was mine again, but it no longer felt like just a vacant plot. It was a symbol, proof, that even against a corrupt system, a single person could fight back and win. I considered selling it, but something inside me refused. This was my uncle's land. He had fought to keep it out of the HOA's grasp for years, and even though he was gone, I had honored that fight. So instead of selling, I did something that would have made Karen lose her mind. I put up a massive billboard at the entrance to Fairview. This land is not under HOA control. Private property trespassers will be prosecuted. A final middle finger to those who had tried to take it from me. Winning didn't mean walking away unscathed. Even after Karen was out of the picture, even after the HOA was restructured with new leadership, I still caught glimpses of watchful eyes in the neighborhood. Some residents still saw me as the troublemaker who had destroyed community order. But others thanked me. Quietly at first, shaking my hand at the grocery store, sending anonymous emails about their own horror stories with the HOA. Some even invited me to speak at community meetings to help expose the deeper corruption that existed in HOAs across the country. I realized then that this fight had never been just about me. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been bullied, threatened, or cheated by those in power. And if I had to go through all of it again, I'd do it in a heartbeat.